Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. So I'm basically going to talk about Julie because I was scrolling through Tumblr in 2021, very active site, definitely peak popularity right now. And I found out about this woman called Julie, and she was a 17th century open bisexual amazing jeweler, and I was like, damn, I need to hear more about her. And so yeah, this is what this video is about. I just think she's so cool, and let's get started. Right, let's get started. She was born around 1673. We don't actually know exactly when she was born, but she was the only child to a secretary of the Count d'Armagnac. And this count, who her father worked for, was a key figure in Louis XIV's court. He was the master of horses, which is apparently like maybe the third most powerful position someone can hold. And yeah, so she grew up in the great stables in Versailles, which was like a mini village of blacksmiths, pages, and like servants. And so she had a very hectic growing up. Her father was an accomplished swordsman, and he actually trained the court pages at Versailles. And her father chose to educate her with the pages, and Julie excelled at fencing as a child. And yeah, so kind of her life gets quite exciting, maybe creepy. I'd say it's more creepy than exciting, because at 14, her dad's boss, so the count we mentioned earlier, she became his mistress. And like lots of sources like kind of debate why she did this, but we do know that apparently her father would challenge any kind of suitor for, oh, hey, you want to marry my daughter, you want to court my daughter? Well, I challenge you to a duel. And him being a very accomplished swordsman, it really scared people off. And I think I like to think that she kind of took back her control and said, okay, I'll pick the one person you can't actually fight. But maybe that's optimistic thinking. So as it always happened, the Count found her a husband, a timid gentleman called de Maupin, who was promptly sent off to collect taxes in the countryside, and to keep kind of the illusion of respectability. And some accounts actually claim that he was sent off the morning after the wedding, so everyone kind of knew it was a sham. But she quickly grew tired of the Count and ran away with a fencing master called Saram. And they basically kind of trapezed around French countryside, scraping together a living by giving fencing demonstrations at fairs and taverns. At one point, apparently, a man refused to believe she was really a woman because she was just that good. She took off her blouse, and crowds fell silent. And the next morning, he didn't learn his lesson. He wolf whistled at her, and she challenged him to a duel and apparently killed him. But this love affair quickly fizzled out. But because of this love affair, she did get to meet and seduce a local merchant's daughter, and this is when her life gets really crazy. So sadly, her lover's family wasn't too keen on the affair, because it's 17th century France. I don't think the family would be very supportive of, lesbian relationships. So they sent their daughter off to a convent to separate the pair, and Julie came up with this incredible, bold, daring plan, which was, luckily a nun had passed away at this convent. Luckily a nun had passed away. That's not a sentence I ever thought I'd say. But basically because of that, Julie could steal the dead body, and she placed the dead body in her lover's room, and then set the whole convent on fire, and the chaos that ensued gave the two lovers the chance to flee. And they were on the run for 3 months, and they were just roaming around French kind of countryside. Julie was actually sentenced to death in absentia by the parliament, and I think it's really interesting because when they were sentencing her, she was actually documented as a man because they couldn't admit that a woman had done that. A woman had grave robbed, they had arson, and pretty much did kidnapping as well, which I think is quite interesting. Eventually, this local merchant girl wanted to return home, and she did, and Julie continued her journey through the French countryside. So, we hear a series of kind of shenanigans that happen while she's on her own in the countryside. One day she bumps into the Comte d'Albert, who challenged her to a duel, not realising she was female because, you hurt my honour, you bumped into me kind of vibe. And she beat him, wounded him, and nursed him back to health. And, some people say that they became lovers, but pretty much all stories do keep the idea that they were lifelong friends. Julie loved nothing better than a duel. We know that she killed or at least wounded more than 10 men in her duels. And I think it was quite interesting because at this time in history, the Sun King, Louis XIV, was trying to centralize power. And but one way of doing that was trying to ban duels because kind of having duels really takes the law into a person's like own hands and kind of doesn't trust the government with kind of dealing with slights and stuff like that. And so at this time, anti-dueling laws in France were becoming much more strict. But actually, Julie did manage to win a royal pardon for dueling on grounds that the laws didn't say anything about women dueling. So, like, all her kind of violence and, like, killing and wounding from her duels were kind of pardoned because they were in the countryside and removed from the city. And also because, you know, the laws didn't actually specifically mention that women couldn't duel, which I think is quite interesting. Because, you know, people back then assumed women couldn't duel. Julie proved them wrong. And then she embarks on an operatic career, which I think is so cool. So while on her travels, she took singing lessons from a retired teacher called Marcel, and found a new lover called Gabriel Vincent Thenard, who was also a singer. And Julie and Thenard returned to Paris. While Julie was visiting her old lover, so the Count, the Armagnac, to convince him to arrange a pardon for her. And this is a pardon for her grave robbing, arson, and kidnapping earlier. Bernard auditioned for the opera, and you know, he was so talented they hired him immediately. And his condition was that Julie was also allowed to audition, and the opera was like, fine, we really like you, why not? And she completely wowed them. So by the age of 17, right, she found herself as a member of one of the world's greatest musical companies. After realizing just how talented she was, the opera actually helped persuade the king to lift the death sentence on her so that she could join them. One critic credited her with having the most beautiful voice in the world. Naturally, the king agreed, and that her talent was worth saving. So she went on to be a star, appearing in all the opera's major productions from 1690 to about 1694. And she was very, very welcome among kind of Parisian art circles and high society. So then she kind of has a fall from favour. So in her career in Paris was interrupted after she attended a ball in men's clothes and she kissed a young woman on the dance floor. Scandalous. And she was challenged to duel by 3 different noblemen for this insult. She told each of them that she would meet them outside and fought them all. We don't know if she fought them one at one or like all at once, we don't really know. But we do know that she won. But because Louis XIV had outlawed duels, and she could get away with it in the countryside because it was removed, and because, you know, she was a woman and they were like, that's not really part of the law. But she couldn't really do that now because she was so well known, and this was in Paris. This was in like kind of the centre of Parisian life. And so if the king pardoned her then, it would really be sending the wrong message. So she fled to Brussels. And eventually she found herself to become the lover of the Elector of Bavaria. But he found her a bit too much to handle. Because like I found out that apparently she stabbed herself on stage with a real dagger one time, just like in a fit of passion, like to really embrace her role, which is, you know, dedication to the craft. And he offered her 40,000 francs to like leave him alone, kind of. She was like, nah, I'm not having any of this, I don't want your money. And she kind of stomped off to Madrid, apparently. So she found herself as the maid to the Countess Marino, while she was in Madrid, and who basically she hated this count. Like before a grand ball, she dressed the countess's hair with the radishes so that everyone but the countess could see them. Needless to say, she was on the road back to Paris before the countess arrived home, completely annoyed. And she did return to the stage after this. So Le Maupin was pardoned for duels, and this time though, this was because of the king's brother. And this actually, I think this is a really important time to mention this. The king's brother at this time was openly in relationships with men, and so this is why Julie could have her kind of liaisons with women, because to then fight against her would be kind of to attack the royal family of a sort. So people were very careful not to do that. And yeah, so she basically returned to the stage as stardom, and she defended lots of chorus girls against like kind of a lot of these French nobles could be quite entitled to these kind of young female performers, and she tried to defend them as much as she could. She actually became infatuated with a soprano called Franchon Moreau, When she was rejected, she said she'd kill herself, but she didn't. And apparently, she later threatened to blow out the Duchess of Luxembourg's brains out at mass over a perceived insult, and she ended up in court for attacking her landlord. Um, she and Thenard, so the guy who kind of introduced her to the opera, remained best of friends until her retirement, although they were a very fiery pair. So one evening on stage, she bit his ear so hard that he bled. And yeah, so her later life was a lot more kind of mellow. So in 1703, she fell in love with the Madame la Marquise de Fronsac, who was claimed to be the most beautiful woman in France, and she was also very wealthy. She was so beautiful that she had to flee to Brussels because the Dauphin was obsessed with her, and she just was not reciprocating that at all. So La Fronsac was also, she was very wealthy, well connected, and the two women like lived in harmony for 2 years until La Fronsac died in 1705. And heartbroken, Julie joined a convent, and 2 years later, she died at the age of 33. And I think it's so interesting, her whole entire life, because she had such a short span of life, but she did so much. And yeah, also you'll hear me saying apparently a lot in this video. The reason being is that a lot of her life was dramatized in a book called Mademoiselle Le Maupin, which was a 17th century novel, and I think that did kind of affect kind of our current modern perceptions of her, because there is a body of writing from her contemporaries, but a lot of our understanding of her is from there. And also after her death, the church refused to bury her in like hallowed ground, I think, because of her kind of whole entire life. But I do think she did start to represent the romantic ideal of like decadence and beauty, so then people did kind of maybe dramatize or hyperbolize her life. So I think all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. She was just an incredible woman who really seemed to challenge kind of 17th century ideas of womanhood, sexuality, and she very much seemed to have agency of her own life, which doesn't happen very often in history. And it seems interesting how she started from at 14 being someone's mistress to becoming perhaps one of the most well-respected operatic singers, and she found love and she found peace. And it's sad that she died early, but I think her story is so interesting. And if you guys are interested in other kind of historical individuals that maybe don't get talked about as much in history, please subscribe to this channel. I think next week I'll be doing Olga of Kiev. She's also an incredible woman that will be really interesting to talk about. And if you guys have any recommendations of how to kind of improve this channel, or any like kind of characters or people to research, please comment down below. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and please like and subscribe if you didn't hate this.